Merely affording somebody with the opportunity to commit a crime in New York is not entrapment. When our investigators go online posing as 13-year-old boys or girls, they are immediately hit on. They do not reach out to anybody. They just put their screen name up and they get a hit. Police Commissioner Richard Dormer. In your opinion, can a pedophile claim entrapment as a defense if the police officer is posing as a 12 or 13-year-old child? Why or why not? Take a moment now to respond to this quote and this question. The last section of this chapter is going to discuss the various forms of entrapment tests. Some defendants in the courtroom claim that the police entrap them as a defense for having attempted to commit a crime. A defendant will be acquitted of the charges if the defense can prove that the police entrapped the defendant into committing the crime. The first U.S. Supreme Court case upholding entrapment defense took place during Prohibition in the 1930s. An undercover federal agent was invited to the home of Randall Sorrells, a North Carolina factory worker. The men talked for a couple hours, then learned that they had served in the same infantry division during World War I. The agent asked Sorrells if he could get him a jug of whiskey. Sorrells declined, saying he did not fool with whiskey. The agent persisted, and finally Sorrells relented. He left his house and returned a half hour later with a jug. When Sorrells handed it over in exchange for $5, the agent arrested him for violating the National Prohibition Act. At trial, Sorrells raised the defense of entrapment, but the trial court did not let the jury decide the issue of entrapment. Sorrell was convicted and he appealed. The case reached the Supreme Court in 1932, and the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that Sorrell should have been allowed to show that he was, quote, a person otherwise innocent whom the government is seeking to punish for an alleged offense, unquote, induced by, quote, the creative activity of its own officials, unquote. Over the years, two separate tests for entrapment have been developed, the subjective test and the objective test. Subjective test is used by federal and most state courts. It requires that the police lure the defendant into committing the crime and the defendant was not predisposed to commit the crime. It is considered subjective because it inquires into the defendant's predisposition to the crime in question. The objective test, on the other hand, requires that the police lure the defendant into committing the crime by doing something that creates a substantial risk that such an offense will be committed by persons other than those who are ready to commit it. This test, unlike the subjective test, does not look at whether or not the defendant was predisposed to commit the crime. Several famous cases have featured the issue of entrapment. The federal government's abscond operation in the early 1980s is an example of entrapment defense that failed. The FBI invented a phony Arab sheikh by the name of Kabir Abdul Rahman to try to bribe one U.S. senator and 7 representatives in Congress. The FBI filmed the sting operation and used the films as evidence in the trials for accepting bribes. The defendants argued that the FBI had entrapped them, but this defense failed. Why? The FBI had received reliable information that these particular congressmen were corrupt. Sheikh Rahman did not approach just any congressman. He chose ones who were reported to show criminal intent already. The FBI said the courts had merely given him an opportunity to do something they already had the intent to do, and therefore the police could not entrap them. On the other hand, the John Delorean case, which happened at about the same time, demonstrates an entrapment defense that succeeded. Delorean was an auto company executive who left Ford in the late 1970s to set up his own sports car company in Northern Ireland. His new gull-wing DeLorean sports car, which was named after himself, came out during a gasoline crisis, and it didn't sell well. It was well known that his company was in deep trouble. FBI agents claimed that the informant told them DeLorean was searching for illegal ways to keep the company afloat. In an elaborate sting operation similar to abscond, undercover operators approached him with a scheme to import $24 million in cocaine. They videotaped him accepting the deal and brought him to trial in 1983. DeLorean's lawyers had argued that he had a clean record, that the government's witnesses were unreliable, and the FBI had lured and entrapped him into the crime. Despite the videotape, the jury found him not guilty. One juror said the way the government acted in this case was not appropriate. In a similar development, in 1992, the Supreme Court threw out the conviction of a man they felt had been entrapped. Postal inspectors thought that a Nebraska man named Keith Jacobson was predisposed to buying child pornography. They sent him an offer in the mail, and he did not respond. For the next 26 months, they repeatedly sent him offers to buy child pornography. Finally, he bought 2 magazines, and they arrested him. He was convicted, but the Supreme Court, on a 5-4 vote, overturned the conviction. The court said that the government had overstepped the line between setting a trap for the unwary innocent and the unwary criminal, and failed to establish that Jacobson was independently predisposed to commit the crime. Lastly, a more recent entrapment case involved war on terrorism. Hemant Lakhani was 69 and a British citizen, was caught in an international sting operation by Russian, British, and U.S. intelligence services. A clothing merchant, Lakhani was approached by agents claiming to be Russians who could supply weapons and agents claiming to be Somalis interested in buying shoulder-launched missiles to shoot down U.S. airliners. He was arrested in New Jersey after receiving a missile, a dud, by the way, from an agent. He was charged with providing material support to terrorists and selling arms without a license. His lawyer at the trial argued that Lakhani had been entrapped. He pointed out that Lakhani was the only person involved who was not an agent. He said to the jury, "Ask yourself, would any of this have occurred without the government?" The government's witnesses described Lakhani as eager to take part. In 2005, a jury rejected his entrapment defense and convicted him of all charges. Now that we've looked at a few examples of how to apply the subjective and objective test, take a look at the class activity on page 47, entitled Were They Entrapped? Use the knowledge you've gained from this section to determine whether these people have been entrapped by the U.S. government and local agencies. Of course, if you have any questions, you know where to find me.